Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MoPod, brought to you by Modate, where we discuss everything Mo, from modern orthodoxy to my opinions and more. I'm your host, Evan Harris, and we have a great guest for you today. Let's get to it. Brief announcement. For all of those that did not see yet, I recently got engaged on Thursday, March 23rd to Malka Hirsch, and just want to thank everyone who took the time to wish us a mazel tov. We really appreciate it. Thank you to all those who were involved in our simcha, who helped facilitate and just helped make things happen. And we just really appreciate everyone and the Moverse, the MoPod, Modate, everyone for all you guys do and all you guys give to us. And Malka is very excited to be the first lady of Modate. And for all the people out there that said that once I got engaged, got married, whatever it is, I would stop doing this, you are incorrect. And so looking forward to continuing to grow the Moverse and, just doing our thing.
Pump the volume.
Today we're sitting down with Dr. Naomi Rosenbach and Dr. Michael Salamon. How are you doing?
Doing well.
Okay, so for those who remember, we've already had Naomi on the podcast, and we were discussing her qualitative findings on the Shidduch crisis in a study that she ran with Dr. Salamon. And now we're having you back to discuss more of the numbers behind the quote-unquote Shidduch crisis. And before we do that, just want to dive into both of your backgrounds. Where are you from? How did you grow up religiously? And you don't have to put yourselves in a box, but how would you identify now religiously?
Ladies first.
Okay, sure. I live in the Five Towns. I grew up probably more in the yeshivish community. I currently am sort of in between the modern Orthodox and yeshivish community. Okay. Did I cover that or?
Yeah. And Dr. Salamon?
Can I be as superficial as Naomi was?
Yeah.
I also grew up in the Five Towns. In those days, there was no real distinction between yeshivish and modern. It was just, you either Hasidic or otherwise. I learned both in modern, what would now be called modern yeshivas, and also yeshivas, and here I am now.
Okay, great. And we all grew up in the Five Towns, so that's a fun fact. So about this study that you guys did, what was the point of the study? Like, why did you think to do it in the first place?
Okay, so the study was actually done several years ago. I started to think about this idea because many people were talking about the so-called Shidduch crisis or the struggles that people were having, and yet I felt there was a dearth of research underscoring what people were saying and the assumptions that people were making. And I was in school, so I'm a clinical psychologist. This is a second career for me. And as I was in school pursuing my PhD, I started to learn about research methodology and specifically social research. And I thought that it would be a really good idea to get some hard facts behind the dating and marriage scene in the Orthodox community.
Got it.
I came to it from a more of a clinical perspective initially. I wrote the book in 2008 called The Shidduch Crisis, Causes and Cures, but that was triggered by two things. In our clinical practice, we have a group practice, and Naomi and I are in practice together. She wasn't at that point, but we were seeing many more young married from people who were having real crises in their marriages. And we were trying to look for a reason for it and correlating that with what brought the people together, how they stayed together, and why they ended up breaking up. But on top of that, I had some personal situations with my own children who had entered the Shidduch price time of dating at that point. And some of those issues were related to how shadchanim would be speaking with me and my children, or the kind of pressure my own children were under, and so forth. So a combination, I've always been involved in research of one sort or another, plus the clinical background issues and the personal issues.
Gotcha. And so it's interesting when I wanted to do some podcasts about the Shidduch crisis, I actually first found Dr. Salomon's book when Googling about the Shidduch crisis. And I reached out on like the contact us on your website. And ultimately, I know a lot of those things don't lead to anywhere, but then we had Dr. Rosenbach on the podcast, and now we got the connections, and we're all here, so that's great. And so about this study, so how many people were involved, and what was like the breakdown of modern Orthodox versus different sects?
Okay. So this was one of the largest scale studies I think ever conducted in the Frum community. We asked, it was actually set up in a very interesting way. That's pretty rare. I haven't seen many other studies set up this way. And what we essentially did was we asked people to fill out their information about their marriage status and hashkafic upbringing. And we asked them to fill that information out for themselves, plus their entire family unit. So if you were under the age of 50, you were asked how many siblings do you have over the age of 18, and can you please fill out all this information for each one of those siblings. If you were over the age of 50, then you were asked to fill this information out for yourself and all of your children. So we started to get this information on full family units, and the reason why we did that was to decrease the response bias. Ultimately, about close to 4,000 people filled out the study. There were the respondents themselves giving us information on over 10,000 individuals. I don't have the numbers broken down per socio-religious category exactly, but it was skewed towards the yeshivish community. So I would say maybe 60-30 or 60-40 or 70-30, something like that, where there were more yeshivish people that responded. Still giving us large numbers on both the Yeshiva Orthodox community and Modern Orthodox community.
Okay, that's great. I mean, I think the response bias part of that is very important, because qualitatively, if you send out any survey, I think people are more likely to fill it out if they're upset with something rather than if they're content with it or happy about it. So any reviews you see, you always have to take those with a grain of salt, because people are more likely to review something, I think, if they're very upset about it. So it's nice that you got people to fill in their family's information so that it's not just people that are angry filling out what they think.
Exactly. That was a way we decreased response bias. It's still not a perfect study, so I would still say the numbers that we're going to talk about today should be taken with that into account. I still think these numbers are important, informative, and really give us a window into what's going on, even if it wasn't a perfect study. In terms of the Modern Orthodox community, we had about, I would say, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 respondents themselves, giving us information on close to 4,000 individuals that identify as Modern Orthodox.
Okay, that's great. So let's get into those numbers, right? So you mentioned to me that you broke out the Modern Orthodox community by like age ranges of 5 years. So you have like 25 to 30, 30 to 35.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, before we get into this, what is the Shidduch crisis in your mind? What do people, not in your mind, because now you have this fact, but what have you heard the Shidduch crisis is?
I'll let you go, Dr. Salamon.
Well, it's a complex question that requires a complex answer.
For sure.
Depends who you're asking, and depends where they stand in the process. Depends if it's a person who's actually in the process, a relative of theirs, people on the outside. The crisis is a complex confluence of issues. Is it that there are too many women or not enough men? Is it that there are too many outsiders controlling the situation? Is it that people are thrown together without really knowing one another and pressured to get married very quickly? We don't have a very good definition of the crisis. And I'm not even sure that calling it a crisis is the right term for it. We could talk about this historically and how this has been handled in other cultures, if you'd like, for a minute or two, and how it's been defined by others. because we looked at that as well.
Sure. We'll get into that after we get to the numbers to figure out what should we call it and how do we, I don't know if I want to use the word fix it, but make it feel better. And so let's get into the numbers now. So what are the marriage rates for 25 to 30-year-old modern Orthodox men, and what are they for the women?
Okay, I just have a comment on something you said before I even say that. I just love how you said feel better. I think that is perfect. I want to get back into that later.
Okay.
Okay, so okay, of course, there's a lot of caveats here. So before I even give over the numbers, right, we have to, when I analyzed the numbers, there were some decisions that had to be made, right? Are we talking about people that are raised modern Orthodox? Are we talking about people that are currently modern Orthodox? There are some differences. So I'll start to give over those numbers. For those that are raised modern Orthodox, regardless of how they currently identify, in the 25 to 29-year-old age category, 32% of women and 42% of men have never been married.
Mm-hmm.
Example. In the 30 to 34 age cohort, 18% of women and 23% of men have never been married. And in the 35 to 39 age cohort, 13% of men and 13% of women have never been married. When we look at those that are currently modern Orthodox, regardless of how they were raised, so this includes somebody that might be a Baal or Balas Tshuva, or somebody that maybe was raised Yeshivish or Hasidish and then shifted to modern Orthodox, the numbers go up by a few percentage points in each age category. And there is something else interesting that happens when you get to the 35 to 39-year-old cohort. We start to see this shift where a larger percentage of women were never married. So 17% of women versus 11% of men have never been married.
And that specifically with people who still consider themselves modern Orthodox?
Yes, regardless of how they were raised.
Okay, so would you say the main takeaways from that are that there's a clear distinction between those who were raised and those who still consider themselves when comparing men and women, meaning that if you were raised modern Orthodox, then men and women are just as married as each other. I don't know how you put that, but like have the same marriage rates as each other. But when you're still modern Orthodox, women have lower marriage rates than men.
That's one takeaway. And I want to be very careful here. Of course, the answer that everybody wants to know when they're talking about the Shidduch crisis is it true that there are more women available than men?
Mm-hmm.
This study did not do an amazing job at answering that question. We still don't have that answer. We could hypothesize based on certain facts that based on some of the data coming out of the study, but yet we still, it really didn't do a great job at answering that question. So meaning that we don't know if the number of males and females are equal to begin with. Therefore, just because there's a lower percentage of men that are unmarried doesn't necessarily mean that there's less men available, if that makes sense. But we could hypothesize that it probably is the case. If a higher percentage of men are married than women, and there are equal amounts of, and they started out equal, then we could hypothesize that there's less male availability.
Got it.
But we have to throw some general data into this mix also, and we don't know how it applies directly to the Jewish world. If you look at U.S. Census Bureau statistics, and you look at who's getting married based on their age and education levels, according to data that came out in the mid-2015 or so, there are approximately 4 women for every 3 college-educated men. And that has an impact on the kind of relationships that people are looking for. John Berger wrote a book called Datonomics. It was published, I think, 2016. And he makes the case that what he calls educational intermarriage is a bit of an issue because of that. Meaning, if women are more educated than men, they're less likely to marry a man who's less educated. We just don't know how that impacts us. We do know that there are issues that might be related when women talk about wanting an earner-learner versus a learner-earner, but nobody has the data on that just yet.
Got it. Definitely makes sense. And so what were your key takeaways from those statistics? Did it make you think, okay, what everyone says is correct? Like there is a shidduch crisis in the modern Orthodox world, and what do you attribute that to? Or did you think that, okay, people are kind of blowing this out of proportion and the numbers are not as severe as people might think, but there still is something going on and we have a reason for that?
So, I like to stay away from the word crisis and talk about facts. And I think
Okay.
that's what the study helps us do. So what we're seeing is it appears that about 13% of those that were raised modern Orthodox are still never married as they get closer to their 40s, both men and women, regardless of whether, there's a discrepancy in availability. I don't know. I don't think it's for me to decide whether this is a crisis. If 13% of men and women really want to get married and start families, and for some reason they're unable to because they're not able to find the spouse that's right for them, and especially for women as they're getting closer to 40 and they have a biological clock ticking, that's a difficult experience. That's why I love how you said feel better. We're trying to help people feel better here. I think it depends on what people want and whether that is a problem or not, that 13% are unmarried.
So the question is 13% a high percentage or not? And how do we define whether it's a high percentage or not? Who makes that decision? In our world, everybody should be married by a certain age, and everybody should be happily married and have children. And if you look at it from that perspective, 13% is overwhelming. But we don't know exactly how some people feel about not being married.
For sure. And so just to take it a step back for a second, you mentioned the marriage rates for people who still consider themselves modern Orthodox when they're between 25 and 30 and between 30 and 35. Could you just state those again?
Yes, actually, for those that are currently modern Orthodox, I don't have it written down the 25 to 30.
Oh,
I
okay.
only have 30 to 34 and 35 to 39.
Okay, sure. So those.
So those that are currently, right? Modern
Yes.
30 to 34, it's 25% of women and 23% of men.
Okay.
And 35 to 39 is 17% of women and 11% of men.
Okay. And what about those who were raised modern Orthodox for the 25 to 30 and the 30 to 35? Or 30 to 34?
Okay, 25 to 29 is 30% of women and 42% of men.
Okay.
And 30 to 34 is 18% of women and 23% of men.
Okay. So based on those stats, I'm going to go on the record and say that what I hear about the shidduch crisis is at least somewhat inaccurate. And from friends, people that are in my life that I've spoken to, about people think there are fundamentally way more modern Orthodox single women than men, way more, not just a few percentage points. Like, I think people sometimes think there's double from the conversations I've had. And your study clearly shows that that is not the case. And so obviously, it's not the whole sample size, but I think numbers would be closer to those huge proportions if they were actually true. So in terms of feeling better, what do you think would make people feel better? Believing there is a shidduch crisis or believing there is not a shidduch crisis? And why?
But there's so many ways, different ways of looking at that. For the person who wants to get married and isn't able to, for whatever the reason is, be it social, financial, religious, it is a crisis. For the person who's not interested in rushing into marriage, it's pressure, because every time they go to somebody's wedding, they get this kind of pressure, or they'll get calls from people saying, Amir Sashem by you, or I have someone for you. For them, it might be a crisis. Can't dismiss the individual feeling of being pressured to do things, whether or not they're ready for it.
So you mentioned before, historically, how situations like this were solved, ameliorated, just how situations were kind of fixed. And so if you want to dive into that now and think about how could other situations relate to this one, and what is the best solution? Is what we're doing right now the best solution, or is there a narrative that should be changed?
So there are at least 3 examples that I can give of situations that were maybe instructive for us at this point. One was, according to a family historian who, for the life of me, I can't remember her name at this point, but she's written several books on how families have developed over the years in the United States. From the mid-1880s until around 1910, the United States actually, in a somewhat socio-cultural way, developed what we would say is very similar to Shidduch dating, meaning that somebody would arrange for people to get together, and they would make sure that the families did some research on them and instructed them how to go out on dates and things like that. It fell apart, according to what I understand of the historians' statements, because most young people didn't like being pressured by the outsiders, who to date, when to date, how to date, and so forth. After the Second World War, actually before the Second World War, but after the Second World War as well, there were issues in terms of how men and women in the frum community were going to meet. I actually talk about this a little bit in my book, The Shidduch Crisis. And as a result of the pressures of needing to meet and so forth, a lot of the poskim, a lot of the rabbanim actually suggested that there be meetings between men and women in group settings, dances, if you will. And a lot of shuls, even very right-wing shuls, held dances for people to meet. And they weren't like what we have today, in the sense that today they have these meet and greet things. But interesting, I was speaking to someone yesterday, a young man, he's 24 years old. He went to a singles event over Purim, hoping to meet people. The women were in one room and the men were in another room. And if you wanted to meet a woman, you had to speak to a shadchan first. And he just kind of left. He was not interested in that. So that's an issue here as well. The third example I can give is, now I don't know how true any of this is because it's not documented in professional journals, but I've seen it in magazines and newspapers. From about the mid-60s, 1960s, until about the turn of this century, South Korea had what we would call a shidduch system also. Again, there would be shadchan and matchmakers who would arrange meetings and so forth and pretty much follow up the way we are. Apparently, there was a pretty significant rebellion against that. And a lot of young people who wanted to date started using digital online dating ways to meet. And in fact, I just met someone, he called me. He's a researcher at a large university. He's not Jewish. He's looking into different types of dating. And his attitude is that for the Jewish world to survive, based on whatever research he's read, they're going to have to use things like J-Swipe to bypass what he called the Shidduch crisis. Now, he's not Jewish. He's not familiar with all the details, and that's why he called. But he may be right. To a certain degree, he may be right. So from a historical perspective, we have those kinds of backgrounds to deal with and use as examples to learn from.
Got it. So I don't know if you're aware of this, Dr. Salamon, but I started a dating platform called MoDate. So we might have to bleep out the J word.
Be my guest.
But no, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so I started a dating platform called MoDate a couple years ago, and still growing and implementing new features, designs. And so one thing I've noticed is that we definitely do have more women than men on the platform. And it's definitely a more significant percentage than the ones you were sharing. And so I'm wondering, why do you think that is? Why do you think it feels like people talk about men in the modern Orthodox world, and I'm sure also in general, just get more suggestions, more dating suggestions, and people say it's easier for them? Obviously, that's not true in every case, but in a large scale, people say it's easier for them. Why do you think that is, that men are more hesitant to join dating platforms, and it feels like men get more suggestions?
So I can respond to that on two levels. One is the research is abundantly clear, and not just for the Jewish world, but overall, women tend to be significantly more devout across all religions than men, and they're less likely to leave religious communities than men are. And as a result, they'll try to stay more engaged. From an anecdotal perspective, having spoken to many men who were raised from and want to be from, but are just fed up with a system that restricts them, they'll go to clubs and pick up women, and they're happy doing that. And that may be their way of dealing with this kind of pressure. Now, again, I don't have hard data on that. It's all anecdotal, but I think it applies to certain people.
Sure. Dr. Rosenbach, you have any comments on that?
Yeah. I think that there is some evidence that there are slightly more females in the modern Orthodox community that are single than males. I think that number is nowhere near the double the amount of women that people think there is. But I do think once you hit this 10 to 13 to 15%, let's say, that are unmarried, I think any skewness in sex ratio, even if it's slightly more availability, sets the stage for a whole host of social phenomena. And there's some research backing that. So if you're in a room with 10 women and 8 men, and they're all trying to find a partner, even though it's double the amount of women, who has the upper hand here?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's happening. I think this slight skewness of more female ability is setting the stage where men are just getting a lot more suggestions, compiled with, by the way, I don't know how it works on these MoDate sort of platforms, but when it comes to shadchanim, it's like the cultural norm is that suggestions are given over to the man first, and the man has to approve them before the woman even cares about them. So I think those two factors, a slightly more female availability together with men just getting more suggestions because they come to them first, sets the stage for women to feel more desperate and feel like there's a lot less availability.
Okay, makes sense. I think you just made MoDate look good because we send to men and women at the same time, the matches. So I think you would be a proponent of that. And so thank you for that unintended compliment. And
I think that's the solutions
That's
here.
the best way to do it. That is
yes,
clearly the only reasonable way to do it.
thank you. So I guess another question I have, I mean, you're both therapists. So a question I have, I don't know if you've dealt with this or have any idea, but just what you think. obviously there's a push in the last few years to be more open about mental health and becoming less stigmatized. And I'm wondering if you think that, similar to mental health, where I think there are studies that show that it's harder for men to go seek help with a therapist than women because of this idea of masculinity, and it's not manly to talk about your feelings. Do you think there's also something similar to this in terms of dating apps and or asking friends for help to help set you up, that it's harder for men to be vulnerable in that way than it is for women?
What a great question. Maybe we should do our next research project on that topic exclusively. No, it's true that men are less likely to seek help for most mental illnesses, mental health problems. How that impacts dating. I know that a lot of men like to go out in groups, just like women do, but they kind of, I don't know that we can state definitively that it impacts how they date. I just don't know. I have some ideas about it, but again, I'm hesitant to make any comments about it at this point.
I guess this might get us off on a bit of a tangent, but I think it's somewhat related. We know that men are less interested in long-term commitment than women are in general. Like, the research does show that. That doesn't mean they're uninterested in long-term commitment, but just women sort of need that more than men. And a man will commit in order to get whatever he needs out of the relationship. There is research that shows that even when there's slightly more female availability, men don't have to commit to get their relationship needs met, because this goes back to them just having the upper hand and having more power, and they're able to get their sexual and intimate needs met from women without needing to commit. So I wonder if men aren't seeking out dating platforms or shadchanim because they're just less interested in commitment, in committed relationships in their 20s and in their 30s. And by the way, I did a dissertation in a similar area, and that's one thing that came out of my dissertation. I asked people to rate how likely they were to commit or how much they wanted to commit to a relationship. And I also looked at how that relates to sex ratio and whether they believe there are more men or more women available. And I did find that men are just less likely to want a committed relationship when they believe there are more women than men available. So going back to your question, do I think it's good for the idea of a shidduch crisis to exist or for people to talk about it in that way? No, I really don't think it's a good idea at all, because it promotes the idea that there's so many more women available than men. And actually that idea is unhealthy and unhelpful. It sets the stage for negative consequences for both. And here's the interesting thing here, for both women and men. Even though men are less likely to commit, the research shows that they do very well in committed relationships. Their mental health increases when they do commit, even if it's not what they ideally want. I don't know, that totally went on a tangent.
No, that's great. I mean, I think that is, one of the key takeaways from this. Everyone always talks about the shidduch crisis, and whether a lot of people are probably using it as an excuse for something, both men and women. And that's unhealthy, whether you're pressuring friends to find someone quickly because you know that once they reach a certain age, or you think that once they reach a certain age, it's going to be way more difficult. So you rush them into something they're not ready for and tell them, oh, there's a shidduch crisis. Or whether you're struggling in your dating, and it might be nice to fall on this crutch of, oh, it's because there's a shidduch crisis. And yeah, there are statistics that show in some age ranges discrepancies, and we don't fully know the numbers, it still is probably not healthy to have that attitude to just rely on that instead of, it's important to do your hishtadlus. Obviously some people are, and I feel bad for the people that are trying their hardest and struggling, but for the most people out there, it's hard. Like, it's probably harder to have this concept exist than it is to just acknowledge that some people struggle with this and some people struggle with other things, and doesn't mean that if you struggle with something, it's a worldwide crisis. So I think that's definitely a good message. So moving on to a segment we do here on the MoPod called the MoPod Lightning Round. I'm just going to fire off some quick questions and you tell me the first thing that comes to your mind. You ready?
Okay.
What is the best restaurant in the 5 towns?
Interesting question. Somebody asked me that. Actually, I was with a group of people. Somebody asked me that walking on Central Avenue yesterday afternoon. And all of us said first Chosen Island
Yes.
as number 1 and Traditions as number 2.
Naomi, do you agree?
I don't have a best restaurant in the 5 towns.
Oh,
Okay,
she's so
Sorry, I'm really boring. I know.
I like Chosen number 1. I don't know if I'd go Traditions number 2. I mean, I like Traditions also, but yeah.
Yeah, well, there's also Doma and there are a bunch of really good restaurants, but Chosen number 1.
For sure. Okay. What's one piece of advice you would give to daters who are currently struggling?
Naomi.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I can't fire it off. One day at a time.
And my response would be keep at it. Just keep at it.
Okay. What was the most surprising statistic that you found from your study?
I wasn't surprised by much of anything. It kind of fits with some of the anecdotal stuff that we've been hearing over the years.
I guess that we didn't get into this much, but I was surprised that from the modern Orthodox community, a very large percentage moved towards yeshiva Orthodox, like 25%.
And how many people moved from modern Orthodoxy to, I don't know what you coined it as, but to less from, or the
not
left?
I have the numbers on not religious.
Not religious.
Modern to not religious.
13% men, I think.
Yeah, and 7% women. So it's about double. That's a key takeaway that we didn't cover much, but about double the amount of men moved to not religious than women. And when you look at those numbers and then never married population, it's about double for each. It moves to like 11.5% of women and 21% of men.
Wow. Okay. Got it. So now we covered it. So that's great. What do you think is more important, the qualitative findings from the study or the quantitative findings?
I think the qualitative findings are more important, actually, because it showed that regardless of marriage rates, which the reason why I think they're not important is because I think they're unsurprising. I think most people know this. But the struggle of the process, so regardless of when people get married and whether they do, for the vast majority that end up getting married, they talk about how it was a really difficult and painful process for years. And I think this doesn't have to be. There's no reason why somebody has to go through this sort of hazing process to get married. We really could make it more pleasant.
Let me just emphasize that point. If you're in a position where people are constantly telling you how to behave, what to do, who to go out with, when you should go out, how to dress, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the pressures are inordinate, and there's no reason for any of that. There's just no reason. People have to learn to be themselves and interact with members of the opposite sex in a healthy way. And that's it. I mean, we don't need people who are not trained therapists to tell individuals who should go out with whom. I think the easier the process is, the healthier it'll be for everybody.
Okay, great answers. Do facts care about your feelings? Okay, there were some shrugs. There were some shrugs. We don't know if facts care about your feelings. Okay, how many chairs are there in the average shul?
150 in men and 100 in women. I don't know. Do you have that data? Because I don't.
No. This isn't a data. This. We're not trying for data here. We're just trying for guesses. Okay.
The shul I daven in, there are about 800. So.
Okay. How much should one spend on a wedding gift if they're not attending the wedding?
As much as they can handle.
Do you agree with that, Naomi?
Yeah, I was gonna say like $100.
Okay. Thank you both for coming on the MoPod. Anything else you want our listeners to know before we sign off?
The one thing I would say is, yes, if you want to get married, just keep at it. You'll get there and you'll find the right person. Don't be afraid. Don't allow people to pressure you.
Okay. Thank you both for coming.
Thank
Pump
you.
the volume.